Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on our second episode of GWI's Blabbering about Broadband. Today, we have a special guest, the CEO and founder of GWI, Fletcher Kittredge. Fletcher, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
By request, of course. Today's topic we're going to be discussing is utility districts, or broadband utility districts, as they're called in the state of Maine. And obviously, it's a very interesting topic that has gained some attention as far as the business model goes, and a new kind of trend in how we expand broadband on a regional level. And so to get right into it, Fletcher, I thought we could start out by kind of discussing what a utility district actually is. And, of course, they're called broadband utility districts in Maine. They're referred to communications utility districts in other parts of the region. So maybe just kind of a little bit of background on what they are, and then we can kind of get down into the weeds about the activity in Maine and on a regional level, and how we go about setting these utility districts up.
Okay, well, broadband utility district is when a group of towns or counties come together to offer broadband build broadband to their citizens. And like you said, they're called communication union districts in Vermont, and broadband utility districts in Maine. But I'm just going to call them utility districts, and we'll take for granted the utility that's being offered is broadband. So what makes them special is they're under Maine and Vermont law. They are a corporation, and it is managed by and controlled by the towns that are members of the utility district. And but because it's a corporation, it has the advantages that a corporation brings. And the biggest one is that it shields the towns that control the utility district from liability. Another advantage is that if revenue bonds are issued by the utility district, then they get favorable tax treatment as if they're a municipality. So it's a separate entity where the liability assets are owned by that corporation, that entity, and it protects the towns. So their tax dollars are not at risk, but the towns can control it because the towns are the board members of the corporation.
Okay, great. And as I kind of mentioned, we have seen, as far as in the state of Maine, kind of an influx and interest in this type of modeling, this type of expansion methodology. From your perspective, Fletcher, why do we see this new increase? I mean, we have expansion efforts all over the state, all over the country. Why the UD model? Why, as opposed to going independent as a municipality, why would you be more interested in that kind of regional approach?
Okay, so where you're seeing these is in areas where there isn't broadband. And what's driving it is, and the reason there isn't broadband is because private companies have not been interested in investing in those areas. And what's driving it is that for the towns, the internet access has gotten so important that a town really can't survive without it. Businesses and young people neither move to nor stay in communities that don't have broadband. It is a necessity. It is a utility now. And for the towns, they have to have it. And the other thing that's driving it is now there's a lot of federal funding available to build these. So the towns have the means and the desire. And so that's the real the reason it's happening now. And for the towns, an ability to control what's going on in their town is important, because they want to make sure that the investment is just not a one-time thing, that they continue to get good service decades into the future.
Okay. And you had mentioned, Fletcher, activity in Vermont. As you and I know, the utility district model in Vermont was created maybe over a decade ago through some activity on the state level.
Yeah.
Are there any examples in Vermont that we can extrapolate that will allow us in Maine to be more precise, to be more strategic on our actions about creating these utility districts? Are there any lessons we can learn from the regional activity?
Sure. Well, so we do Northern New England, which is Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Vermont is ahead of Maine, and Maine is ahead of New Hampshire when it gets to this area. Now, Vermont had its first communications union district start up about 10 years ago, and that's EC Fiber, and that worked well. So the state really decided that the way that they were gonna deploy rural broadband is to really embrace the communications union district model. So now all of the unserved areas of Vermont essentially have a communications union district either forming or already formed. Most of them are already formed. And the state is funneling the federal money primarily to the union districts. And the default is that the money goes to a union district, and if there is, and if that isn't an option for whatever reason, then the money can go to a private provider. So they've leaned heavily into that model, and they've already got some up and running, some pretty big ones. And we do business with two of them, EC Fiber, which I mentioned, which is 31 towns, and East Central Vermont, and then Deerfield Valley Fiber, DV Fiber, which is in the southeast corner of the state, which is 24 towns. EC Fiber is been around for about 10 years and is for the 31 towns, it's probably 80-85% complete with universal service, and we'll be finishing up the portion over the next couple of years. And DV Fiber is just starting the build process now. So they've gone fairly heavily into that model. Now there are some union district broadband utility districts already in Maine. The first one that's furthest along is Down East Broadband, which is Baileyville, Calais, and some surrounding towns. There's Midcoast in the greater Camden, Rockport, Rockland, and the towns to the west, the rural towns to the west. There's Katahdin up in the Millinocket, East Millinocket, and Medway, and there are a couple of others forming in the Western Mountains.
Great. And obviously, the state of Maine has, I'm sure, taken notes and lessons from obviously Vermont being a little bit ahead of us, and most recent legislation has allowed and promoted this kind of creation of utility districts and this way of going about broadband expansion on a far more regional level, as opposed to kind of a hamlet by hamlet methodology, which we've seen a lot in the past. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say is the hamlet by hamlet, one of the major advantages is there's economies of scale. And for any one town to do it by itself is a heavy lift. And the more towns you have, the more people you can serve, the lower your cost per person is. So that's another driver for the regional nature of it.
Absolutely. So obviously, just as it always is when building broadband networks, there are many steps to this equation, and it can be fairly complicated. And so I kind of wanted to talk with you a little bit more about the process of utility districts and establishing them, and maybe you could kind of walk us through how you go about organizing these and the kind of the first phase of creating these utility districts, kind of the process about establishing them, organizing them, and then inevitably launching them.
So that's a good question. Well, it needs to start with a set of committed volunteers in at least 2 towns. And you probably want to start with 5 towns or more. And you need a set of volunteers to spin this up and to be the initial board of the utility district. And there is a fair amount of money now available through federal funds and state funds. These things generate revenue, a fair amount of revenue. So the utility districts can hire out much of what they do, but ultimately they need to be controlled by the towns. And so that means you need a set of people in the towns who are willing to be that board and have the background to do it. So your first step is usually, and most communities have this, you need to form a broadband committee at the town and get the town to buy into the process. And there's going to be, there's probably to join the utility district, the best way is to do it through some sort of town meeting. Legally, whether or not it's required is kind of an open question from the various different lawyers that I've talked to, but best practice would definitely be to have a warrant on the town meeting saying the town wants to join the utility district. Then at that point, you can engage consultants. There's one North Light, which is a group of people with utility district in Maine background. If you're doing it in Maine, there's got some lawyers on there. And they can walk you through the process, but essentially you need to create a corporation. The corporation needs bylaws, and the towns need an agreement on how they're going to work together when it comes to this corporation, what are called interlocal agreements. And because this has been done before, there's samples of all those documents, and there are plenty of law firms out there that will help you with the process. 2 that have done a lot of work in this area. One is Bernstein Shore, and the other is Eaton Peabody, which are both Maine firms. You set up the corporation, you agree to a set of bylaws, the towns agree to an interlocal agreement, at least the initial towns, and then at that point you can start applying for funding. And it's usually what happens is you start out with a set of kind of pioneer committed towns, 5 to 7, or some number. And it's very common to have other towns join the utility district later. Usually the way it works is the towns that join, they have to take things as they are. The pioneer towns get to kind of set the rules, and the people who join later, they have to sign in with the current state of play. But that's a very common model to have them join later. Funding, there are some major tranches of federal funding. I mean, there's a general, you hear a lot of people say this is a once in a generation opportunity for federal funding. There's depending on how you measure it, There's about $70 billion of federal funding flowing through the system now that is either been allocated or will be allocated over the next 18 months. So you want to be in place to take advantage of that. It would be optimal, given the way the funding's flowing, to be in a position to take advantage of it by Labor Day of this year, and then for the initial tranche, and then a larger tranche is coming early next year. So if you don't get on the train fairly soon, you're going to miss out. So in addition to federal funding, there's another good form of funding, which is revenue bonds, utility revenue bonds. The utility district offers bonds backed by, not by assets, but by the revenues of the utility district. And these usually are considered low risk. So they get a pretty good interest rate, particularly because in terms of tax treatment, they're considered municipal bonds. So state and federal taxes, they're tax-free when it comes to state and federal taxes.
Great. I want to touch base and go back a little bit to the financing aspect of this, Fletcher, because just, as most people who are interested in broadband and broadband expansion and networking know, that it obviously costs money, and sometimes navigating these financing models and funding sources becomes fairly challenging. Are there organizations out there that can help these towns kind of navigate those waters? Are there consultancies? Is it the law firms that you referenced?
Yeah.
Are there private companies? Who is out there to help these areas kind of navigate these challenging waters, I would say?
Well, given the relative cost, I wouldn't use the law firms as consultancies. I'd use them for legal work. But you can get an awful lot far away for free. The Maine Connect Maine agency, the state of Maine, and the Maine Connectivity Authority, which is another agency. Those two agencies work very closely together, but they've established resource pages for utility districts, and that's a good place to go. So start out with the state of Maine, look at their resource pages. It covers a lot of territory, and web search is your friend. There's a lot of information that way as well. When it comes to doing things, there are lots of economic development and nonprofits that could act as the conveners of these out there. But if you don't have access to them, or if you're in a hurry, there's also consultancies. Like I said, Northlight's one. There's Casco Bay Advisors. There's Mission Broadband. Those are technical advisors generally. Axiom. So those three: Axiom, Casco Bay Advisors, and Mission Broadband. They tend to do technical work, but they also should know about utility districts and could be a resource.
And you would reference, Fletcher, not necessarily when you're trying to prop these up, not necessarily starting out with just 2 towns, but maybe 5 towns. Is there a ceiling for these utility districts where you get to where it's just too many towns trying to work through this? I mean, is there a sweet spot for if you're looking to try and create one of these utility districts? Is there too many towns, too few towns? I mean, what is that kind of threshold that people should be looking at that regional level?
So, the ones we work within Vermont, the model over there is to have a board member for every town that's served, and oftentimes there's an alternate board member. So, we'll get into dealing with a 50-person board, and that's not as bad as it sounds, because a lot of work gets done by committee, either a governance committee, an executive committee, marketing committee. And Colin, I know you're actually familiar with working with some of the marketing committees, technical committee, finance, and all that. So board size, it is a factor to deal with, but there's certainly tools for doing it. Some of the utility districts in Vermont are upwards of 55 towns. Those tend to be small rural towns, but that would suggest a board with any ex officio members and one from each town plus some alternates. You're probably getting pretty close to 100 people on the board, and that's fortunately we have the tools now with the internet and computers to deal with that size, and thank goodness for Zoom. Of course, if you're from a utility, a place that's unserved, and I run into this again and again. Board members are in a place with bad or no broadband, and they're trying to participate, and it's tough. So that's an issue. So on the upper end, my guess is you're not going to run into an issue where the district is too large. I think there is a problem with it being too small. You've got to have a certain critical mass before things work. And my guess is, and that need for critical mass plays out in a number of areas. First of all, in terms of a board, given the amount of work done, you're going to want, you're not going to want a really small board. As much as it might feel good to have something that's easy control because there's only a few members, you're really going to want a board of, I would think, at least 10 people. And then in terms of funding and operation, you need, you're going to need a couple of thousand households to make things really viable. So, that means you got to, if you're like 3 people per households, you're going to have to put together a set of communities that have at least a population of about 6,000. And I think that's really on the low end. So the bigger you get up until, quite a large size, the more viable you're going to be. The less risky things are when you have greater scale. The less likelihood, you'll end up with a board where just 1 or 2 people are doing all the work, and either they get sick or they get, burned out or whatever. So scale is your friend. And it's also just the economics work better.
Now, for you and I to have this discussion, it seems on the face of it fairly simple, but as we know, for towns, this can be fairly daunting. And as we've discussed, it can be complicated, and there are resources out there to help municipalities navigate through all of the complications and financing methodologies. Fletcher, do you think there are certain things that towns should be prepared for when endeavoring to create utility districts? Are there potential hurdles that people should be prepared to have to jump over? Or, as we always know, patience is a virtue, and we always encourage these areas and towns when trying to create new networks that they have to be patient. But are there certain specific things that we can tell the general public to look out for when starting this process?
Well, I think the biggest issue from my perspective is the sense that this is complicated or complex. And I can see if you're coming at it and it's the first time you've ever heard about it, anything that is new will have that sense that you'll have that sense of unease. But it really is not very complicated at all. I mean, utility districts like water districts have been around for, or power have been around for over a century in Maine and other places. And they're not that complex. And, you know, when it comes to the broadband, if you're new to it, it seems that complex. But, you know, fiber optic, which is what universally all these utility districts are doing, or at least the vast majority of what they do, really isn't that complicated at all. It's a lot easier than say, the old dial-up modems are technically, it's a lot less complicated than the old dial-up modems were actually very complex pieces of equipment, or DSL or wireless. It's glass and a laser. It's, you know, it's sending information. Think of it as instead of stringing tin cans, it's with flashlights. So that's pretty easy. The thing I would say the biggest thing, and it's only in Vermont where some of these utility districts have been around for a while. The thing that actually makes it complex is that these utility districts end up in the beginning, they require you know, lots of federal money and to get started. But once they're up and operational, they generate a lot of cash. And that is one of the reasons why towns are interested in getting involved in that, because they want to see the cash generated by their citizens' broadband fees stay in the community, and either to lower the prices in the future of broadband, or investing as new waves of technology come out, so we don't end up stuck in the same place in 10 years when new technology is needed, but the private, the private network owners have been siphoning the cash out and are looking for another handout to build again. And so that's a complication, but it's down the road. But it's something that really an eye needs to be kept on it. And when that day comes, the communities need to be sure that they're investing in auditing and oversight, which fortunately there'll be a lot of money to pay for. So, I would say the biggest issue is that it's new to people and there's some conceptual frameworks to climb, but it's not really that hard once you get used to it, and there are resources. The people in Vermont have been very good about, talking to, sharing what they've learned, which is nice. And I also think the early utility districts in Maine, likewise. And then down the road, there's going to be a question of what is done with the excess cash generated.
Well, it's certainly very exciting, obviously, to see, areas in Maine take this approach. And I know that we both are excited to see more network expansion on whether it's a regional level or a county level. Obviously, it helps expedite the process of solving the underserved issue that we as a rural state are dealing with, as many other states across the country also are. Fletcher, that's it for me. Do you have any last words? Anything else you want to share about the topic that you think would be relevant for the public listening?
I think we pretty much covered it, or at least in the introduction. There's obviously a lot to dig into, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I mean, I've been interested in this for a long time. I was on in the last decade, I was on the board of one of the first utility districts over in Vermont, and it just I really didn't know much about it before then, learned a lot, and just was really fascinated as someone who's been interested in rural broadband for a long time. And how do we solve the problem essentially once and for all, a solution that will last for many decades? And this seems, this really has seen the best model that I've seen. The combination of, federal funding and local control is really useful.
Awesome. Well, I think from my perspective overall, I think what I would like to tell the general public who is listening in today and potentially down the road, that you can do it. Have faith in yourselves, have faith in your community, be patient, play nice, but this is an effective way of solving the problem, as you just mentioned. And really looking forward to seeing what the state of Maine and New Hampshire down the road will do with these utility districts, and see the growth in broadband and reliable broadband in these really, really rural areas that unfortunately have been previously unable to attain financing or attract any sort of private companies to take care of this on their own. So this is certainly a workable methodology, and looking forward to seeing what happens in the state of Maine for years to come.
Yes, I agree with all that, but I do believe in, in patience. Patience is a great virtue, but given the fact that we, at this point, there's 3 or 4 months before the funding windows start to open, I would actually counsel that if you're listening to this and it's May, you really ought to get started immediately and reach out to us or someone or the Connect Maine Connectivity Authority or to get started right away.
No time to waste if you want the money.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, look at Fletcher. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate everybody listening in. Look forward to having you guys all on episode 3. Have a wonderful day, and we'll be in touch.